This is a production of Cornell University.
Great, thank you, Andy. Hope you can hear me. Welcome. It's always a privilege to be able to present a seminar. I'm going to talk about soil health, carbon, and nutrients, and try to kind of bring some of these things together and based on our recent research. First I want to sort of acknowledge it's been a while. I haven't seen many of you for probably over a year. This is what I looked like about a year and a half ago when the picture was taken by Kirsten Kurtz. And so we've all aged a little bit, and this is kind of what I look like now. No, that's just a joke. This is one of those apps that makes you look older. So don't worry, you can see me here on the screen. I'm still healthy. All right, what we'll cover, soil health, and I won't go into detail because it's something that we've talked about a lot. Carbon and nutrient flows, because that's really an important consideration, and I'm going to back that up with some interesting results. And then we'll shift and talk about nitrogen and why it's important and the challenges with it, and how nitrogen and soil health kind of interrelate. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about computational approaches through AdaptN and why that is a way to move forward, and how we integrate nitrogen, soil health, and carbon management. And then sort of at Andy's request, I'll talk a little bit about public and private sectors. And, because of my experience working with Yara International on my sabbatical last year, try to convey some perspectives on that as well. Okay, I also like to start out with, at this sort of very basic level on my perception on what makes soils. And, soils we kind of start out with particles, not solid rock, but particles. And what soil particles have this ability to retain water in its pores between the particles. And that's, we call that capillarity. And it's really a very kind of foundational process in soils because by being able to hold water, soils can slowly dissolve minerals, typically with a little help from some acidity from the air. That creates weathering that dissolves minerals, and the soils then also have the ability to retain those minerals through various bonding mechanisms. And the secondary processes is then because there's water and there's minerals, and then there's sort of the genetic base for organisms to use that. And then we bring in basically an organic component. So plants, to some extent, other organisms as well, then take the carbon and the nitrogen from the air. It doesn't come from the soil minerals. That's what comes from the air. And it captures that through photosynthesis. It captures solar energy, and that basically builds up in the soil. It supports other organisms, either soil-borne or above ground. We basically build a storage reservoir for carbon, nutrients, and water. That's really what the soil is, and a healthy soil has plenty of that. But there is sort of a saturation point. Soils can hold a certain amount of carbon and nutrients, and primarily defined by things like texture and climate and vegetation, what the original vegetation was, and drainage, etc. Okay, but I like to see soils as the storage reservoir that supports all these terrestrial life forms, and of course also the food system. But just to give you a sort of a sense, is the soil has 1% organic matter in the soil. Contains about 10,000 kilograms per hectare of carbon and about maybe 1/10 of that in nitrogen. So this is a reservoir that we then can use for various purposes, and we've certainly done that, because much of the land that is in any way productive, has been converted for human uses. And in some parts of the world, a long time ago, in the Americas, relatively recent. And so what we did, we cleared the vegetation, we tilled the soil, we stimulated the decomposition of the organic matter and release of those nutrients. With that, some negative impacts, the physical exposure and the degradation of the structure caused erosion. But in general, through agriculture, we slowly kind of reduced this reservoir. We slowly depleted it. and some of the associated functioning that went with that was also becoming compromised. So here's a picture that was taken by Kirsten from a soil in eastern Nebraska. That on the left is the virgin equivalent, and on the right is a field that was right adjacent to that remnant, the virgin remnant. And obviously you see less organic matter, you see structural degradation and all that. And if you do this, of course, for a long time period, especially in a system where a lot of the carbon and nutrient are not very well cycled, you end up sometimes with extreme situations like we had with the dust ball, or what you maybe see here, a picture from erosion in the Palouse. So that's sort of the history, and we now recognize that those are some of those problems and that we can address that. So this graph here, you may have seen it. It's from the USDA Economic Research Service that shows the technological innovations that sort of helped improve agricultural productivity. So the inputs that's the green line, have been relatively stable, but the outputs have gone up a lot and have kind of quadrupled from, say, 1930 to 2020. And the total factor productivity kind of went along with that. And these are, the innovations that, you're sort of familiar with. I think that in a couple of years from now, soil health will also be on this. I really, truly believe that the productivity of the soil through its health is in many cases compromised, and addressing that, I think, will allow us for some productivity increases. So I hope to see this little box here, soil health practices, on the graph in a couple of years. So I already did it for him just to make it easy. So here it is, soil health practices. We're going to have some benefits from that. So I just a couple of months ago, I finished working on a chapter for the book that Janice Thies and Norm Uphoff are publishing. They're working on the second edition, Biological Systems. I forgot the exact title, but many of you are familiar with the book. It's a great book. But if we think about soil health and how we assess it, how do we monitor it, we can kind of think of a hierarchy. At the highest level, we have sort of ecosystem services like food production, water availability, things like that. So we can assess that by these very general metrics, overall food availability at the global level or national level or regional level or whatever. Ecosystem services are supported by functions of the soil. So one of the functions is to support plant growth. So we can assess that by, say, measuring crop yield, which we now can do very easily in many cases because we have yield monitors. We can even look at the spatial distribution of the yield. Functions are supported by processes like mineralization rate or infiltration. Those are difficult to measure typically and expensive to measure. So we often resort to indicators that are easier to measure, inexpensive, and that will tell us something about how the processes are working and therefore how the soil is functioning and what the ecosystem services outcomes are. So we've been focusing a lot on soil indicators. And because I wrote this chapter, I sort of did a review of what's all out there. And so this is a table that shows the physical, biological, and chemical indicators, because soil health really is about the integration of those three realms. And what sort of are the common measurements? So on the right side, you have sort of your typical chemical indicators, extracted macro and micronutrients, which are typically an indication of how well they are available to plants. Very well established technology by now. A lot of good work had been done in the 40s to the 60s, and everybody now uses a typical soil test. So that's well established. pH, also, of course, salinity, acidicity, where appropriate, as well as toxic elements and other contaminants. On the left side, I think we've seen quite a bit of convergence around physical indicators, especially aggregate stability being extremely valuable, very good indicator of how the soil is performing physically. And then some other ones, plant available water, macroporosity, and bulk density. The central column is the biological indicators. And because we haven't really done that much. The soil science community, this is a little bit more of a frontier still. There's a lot of new methodologies that have been developed that are being tested, and there hasn't been quite as much convergence yet on what are appropriate indicators. And they range from, a basic soil organic matter content, or maybe carbon and nitrogen by combustion analysis, to simple measurements like respiration, permanganate oxidation of carbon, which we call active carbon, to some of those other ones like the fatty acid profiling, enzyme profiling methodologies, all the way to molecular genetic profiling through DNA analysis. And so we're still kind of sorting that out. Some of our colleagues like Janice and Dan Buckley are kind of working actively in this area, many around the country as well. Now, because we started to work in soil health about 20 years ago, we were early developers of soil health assessment, and developed what we now call the CASH approach, Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health. And you see a sample report here. We focused on 4 physical, 4 biological, and 7 chemical indicators. And they were primarily selected based on how they related to soil processes, whether they were low cost, easy sampling, and all that. And that has held up since we rolled this out in 2006, has held up pretty well. So we measure these indicators, we interpret the numbers, we score them, we look at an overall score, and we link them to management guidelines. And we've talked about that before, so I don't want to go into details, but I need to give you a little bit of background because of what I'm going to be presenting next. So one of the things that we were interested in, because we were starting to accumulate a pretty good database on soil health, is that a few years ago, I asked Aubrey Fine, who was at the time had just finished her master's degree in our department, and she worked with us for a while, whether she was interested in doing some data analysis. And so one of the things that we looked at was, is there any difference between different regions of the country? And we had enough data for the Northeast, of course, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Midwest. And of course, we sort of expected that the Midwestern soils in general would be of higher health, better scores, you might say, in part because they're grassland soils and all that. Well, we were surprised that it was actually the opposite, that it turned out that for these indicators, the Midwestern soils tended to score the lowest. So if you, for example, look at the organic matter content, the Midwestern soils had a full 1% lower organic matter content than the Eastern soils on the average. Aggregate stability, quite a bit lower, 25 versus, in the 40s. And so this really puzzled us. And but the initial explanation that we had is like, well, there's probably differences in cropping systems. Most of the samples in the Midwest came from corn, soybean fields, while most of them from the East Coast were more, maybe had involved livestock or manure application, some, maybe organic farms and things like that. So that sort of got us on a path of looking at cropping systems. But basically what it does come down to some extent is the basic mass balance of carbon and nutrients, what goes into the soil and what is being lost, right? So you kind of have, if you have the losses less than the gains, then you kind of build up a good pool of soil organic matter. If you have the reverse, then of course you kind of deplete the soil organic matter. It's basically as simple as that. And to put that into some general numbers, so if we think of a natural system, or maybe an integrated crop livestock system, maybe something that maybe more resembles a farm maybe 100, 200 years ago, there was a lot of cycling of carbon and nutrients, either completely naturally, leaf litter or die-off of roots and other biomass. But maybe in these integrated systems, maybe you lose a little bit of the carbon and nutrients, maybe the milk and the meat got sold or something like that. But you mostly have, the carbon and nutrients cycled. But we've developed more into specialized agriculture, where we now have a lot of, we might say, cash grain operations, where the focus of the production system is on producing grains, and then those grains are being harvested and sold off the farms. So that can be corn, soybean, sunflower, wheat, those kind of crops. And in that case, 60 to 70% of the carbon and nutrients is lost. It's being taken off the field and sold off the farm. And so a much lower percentage is being returned. Add to that maybe additional losses from tillage and erosion. And now you have a system where the carbon and nitrogen nutrient cycling is very, very limited. And so in a cartoonish way, I put the little earthworm here on the left. That's a happy worm because there's a lot of nutrients and energy available. And on the right, it's a nervous worm. And we often see that reflected into a lot of the biological indicators that show less favorable for those kind of cropping systems. So, and it basically has to do with, at the larger scale with, transferring carbon and nutrients from areas where we dominate with cash grain operations like we do in the central part of this country, the so-called corn and soybean belt, or maybe the Palouse region in Washington. And a lot of those products are then some of them are being used within the region for livestock production, but some of it gets shipped to places like Western New York, where we have a lot of farms, or the Carolinas, where there's a lot of hog production, or dairy farms in California and Idaho. And so these grains are easy to ship. And so we have this transfer, this flow of carbon and nutrients. And we see that at the global level because many countries are unable to feed the population at the current and desired diets. They just simply don't have the land resource base. Think of Japan and Korea being very mountainous countries. There's very little land available. And China, of course, with a very large population, 1.4 billion, even though it has quite a bit of agricultural land, it still needs to import a lot of grains, especially soybeans, which is also difficult to grow there. It's difficult to grow in Europe as well. And so basically the Americas and three countries, US, Brazil, to a lesser extent, Argentina, are the major grain exporters. But the way I'd like you to see this also is, we're also exporting carbon and nutrients, the basic ingredients of soil health. And of course, we're exporting water because it takes water to produce those crops. And that's where we are. That's the global system. And there's advantages to that. And I think it keeps a lot of people alive, but there's also some strain on the health of the soil. And then, of course, on the other end, we have now a problem with accumulation of carbon and nutrients in areas where these grains are being shipped to. And these are primarily the areas where we have a concentration of livestock. For some economic reason, it seems to be better to be raising livestock, or including dairy, in concentrated areas. But it does sort of create some problems with all these carbon and nitrogen flows. So not only within the US, but many other places around the world. So if you look just at pork production, I think this map says it all. A lot of it is being produced in areas where they don't have sufficient land base, and that's why we're shipping a lot of these grains around the world. And it benefits the U.S. farmers, but it doesn't benefit the health of the soils. And it also creates, increasing problems with issues like hypoxia in estuaries and all that, because we're moving all this carbon and nutrients around. So, of course, a lot of the nutrients are being replenished through fertilizers. So whether it's potassium from Saskatchewan, or phosphorus from Florida or Idaho, places like that, or maybe nitrogen from fossil fuels. But what does not get replenished is the carbon, the biological component, sometimes also not the micronutrient. And so, yes, there's a balance, although that creates problems too, because we may be running out of phosphorus fertilizer. But we're sort of creating this distribution of carbon and nutrients that is not really favorable, in that we are becoming very deficient in some areas, and we see excesses in other areas, right? So carbon and nutrient flows affect soil health. So going back to our cache database, as part of the New York Soil Health Initiative, Joseph Umsili, who I think most of you know, he's an extension associate working with the program as the coordinator. He did an analysis of the effects of different cropping systems within New York, because we had a pretty good amount of soil samples to analyze. So based on crop codes, we were able to identify different cropping systems. So grain crops, primarily associated with crop codes, corn, soybean, wheat, et cetera. Dairy crops, corn silage, alfalfa, et cetera. And the big difference, of course, being that with the dairy crops, there's the cycling of carbon and nutrients because the crops are being fed to the animals, and the nutrients and carbon come out the back end and go back onto the field, while the grain crops, of course, export most of the carbon and nutrients. Pastures is like dairy crops, but not disturbed, not tilled. So that's a good situation. Processing vegetables are a little bit like grain crops in terms of the carbon and nutrient flows. But we also looked at mixed vegetables that are typically smaller, heavily managed systems that focus on the local markets, often organic, or associated with supplying local restaurants and all that. So they, of course, use a lot of compost or maybe manure, cover crops, et cetera. So they have a lot more carbon inputs. So I won't go into a lot of details. There's a report that we published. Also, Joseph is going to be giving a seminar on this and talking about a lot more. I don't want to go too far with this. Just I want to show you the organic matter results. Okay, that's the only one that I'll show, Joseph. Don't worry about it. But you can see here that the systems that have a lot of carbon and nutrient exports, end up with lower organic matter contents than the ones where there's a lot more cycling, and especially pastures being sort of the best situation for obvious reasons. So you see quite a bit of differences, but I'd like you to kind of look at it more in terms of relative to what you might say is like a minimum amount of carbon that you might expect on the average in soils, which maybe is about 2%. That's just a general number. It's kind of like comparing people's heights, adults' heights, and you can kind of start at 5 feet because most people are above 5 feet, right? So if you look at differences, start from 5 feet and measure the difference. So if you do that here, you can see that there's quite a bit of difference in terms of the more active, biologically relevant organic matter. What this also shows is quite a bit of difference in terms of the potential for improvement. So clearly, the annual grain and processing vegetables have more potential for improvement, also have more potential for carbon sequestration and carbon storage, and Joseph will talk about that. So what we've really learned is that soil health varies through natural variation, like texture, drainage, climate, vegetation, chlorpt, if you want to use that term, and spatial processes. I talked about that in a previous seminar, how there's a kind of carbon and nutrients move from the hillsides to the valleys and the deltas, basically. But now also we've seen that the anthropogenic factors are really important. Cropping systems and the nitrogen, the nutrient and carbon flows with that, and by management practices. Are we using cover crops? Are we using reduced tillage, et cetera? So when we think about approaches to building soil health, I think most of us are familiar with that. We've learned about cover cropping, reduced tillage, and all that. And I think you can look at it in terms of reducing the losses of carbon and nutrients, like using reduced tillage, increasing the capture of carbon and nutrients, like better rotations, cover crops, perennialized rotation certainly, and growing healthy crops, high biomass crops. And maybe the third component that we maybe need to start looking at is bringing the carbon and nutrients onto the farms that are deficient. So we clearly should prioritize some of the fields that are clearly deficient. So one way to do that is to kind of rethink the agricultural systems at the local, regional, national, even the global level. So think about exporting and importing carbon and nutrients, reconnecting the animals with the crops in the soil. And maybe targeting the soils that are most efficient. That's where we're going to have the most benefits, both in terms of improving soil health as well as carbon capture. So I want to segue now to nitrogen because, as you know, carbon and nitrogen are heavily interlinked. A lot of the nitrogen in the soil is in organic form and thereby associated with carbon. So we've established that soils vary in the carbon and nitrogen conditions through natural and anthropogenic practices. And that if we are going to be doing more in terms of improving soil health, and we're going to be using some of those soil health enhancing practices, we're also creating a much more complex carbon and nitrogen environment. Okay, so if you just in a simple, growing corn for grain and all the nitrogen is applied by fertilizer, there's not that many factors involved. It's basically how much organic matter is there and how much might be mineralized. But when you bring in these more labile forms, or you change the organic matter content by tillage or organic amendments, you have a more complex system. Okay, so now with nitrogen, of course, we have a lot of additional concerns. It's from an agronomic perspective, it's expensive. The use efficiency tends to be low. And there's lots of issues now with climate change because it's very sensitive to either excess water or droughts. And we have these multiple environmental impacts that that haven't gone away. Energy needs to produce nitrogen fertilizer, the nitrous oxide being the largest source of greenhouse emissions from agriculture, and the groundwater and hypoxia issues in terms of water quality, and the particulate formation from ammonia that causes respiratory problems, which in some cases may have exacerbated some of the concerns around the current pandemic. Now, in the past, we've relied very heavily on these biological processes that I mentioned to go from non-reactive to reactive nitrogen. Of course, we know 80% of the air is non-reactive nitrogen. It's extremely plentiful. But it's the reactive nitrogen that sort of oddly, you might say, has been a very limiting factor. So these biological processes that you're familiar with have been the primary source. And then over the past 100 years, we've seen these industrial processes like Haber-Bosch that have allowed us to basically generate non-carbonaceous nitrogen. Okay, so nitrogen without the organic matter. The Birkeland-Ede process, I'm just highlighting that because the company I worked with last year, Yara, was a part of Norsk Hydro, which is the company that developed this process. What's interesting about that is now it's much less efficient than Haber-Bosch, but there's an interest in it because you can basically generate green nitrogen fertilizer by using not having to use fossil fuel. So there's kind of a resurgence in that. And then, of course, we have then all these transformations in the soil from either the synthetic or the organic sources, and they are very much mediated by the conditions in the soil and the temperature and the moisture conditions. It's a very space-time dependent dynamic system, basically, and it becomes then more complex the more organic sources we have. And then the management aspects are, it matters whether you're using no-till or something like that. So we have a complex situation. So how are we addressing that? The map here on the right is shows the nitrogen recommendation systems that are used around the state, and we basically have more or less 50 systems because we have 50 states and we have 50 land-grant universities, and every university has to have their own system. And I love the land-grant university system, but I think this is where it's a problem. And so you can go from one state to another, and under the same conditions, the nitrogen recommendation can vary quite in quite a ways. I mean, sometimes 50 to 60 pounds per acre. So, and a lot of it has to do with sort of history and the fact that there are people at each university who are responsible for those recommendations. So they sort of have an incentive to kind of keep their own system. And so that becomes then very difficult when we talk about tools like Adapt-N that are in a way kind of disruptive, you might say, in a benign way. And so that has been a real challenge for us. Then there's also sort of that a lot of the standards and the regulations are built around these state-by-state systems. And the nutrient recommendation systems are somewhat unique within our discipline. We don't see that with, say, conservation practices or tillage systems where we don't have everything different from state to state. Then the other thing that we were challenged by is sort of the skepticism about digital technology. So if you have a very simple recommendation system and focused on a fertilized based system, that's very easy to understand. If you start to bring in much more complex technology, people are sort of standing back and say, oh, wait a minute, I don't quite understand this. But the fact of the matter is, and I'm going to be very candid about that, many of these recommendation systems are quite outdated. They were developed in maybe the 1970s, 60s, and things have changed. So the approach that we are now looking at is the so-called 4R process, and the industry is also very much buying into that. 4R or 4R plus is the Nature Conservancy is promoting that. That means 4R plus, good conservation or soil health management. So 4Rs relate to the right source, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. And this all makes sense. And we can we have a pretty good idea of what are good sources of nitrogen, especially in the context of how it's placed. The timing, typically closer to the crop uptake, is better. The placement, typically in the soil or placed according to the different soil types. But the one that's really difficult is the right rate. Because how do you determine the right rate in this very complex system? Okay, so what is right here? So in a paper from a couple of years ago, Shai Sella, who was a postdoc with me, we basically tried to kind of bring that together in terms of creating this understanding. It's a dynamic system, but when you change one component of the system, or you change more than one component of the system, there's this dynamic interaction, and it's not a simple additive process. Everything interacts with everything else, right? So the basic resources such as soil type, soil health, like organic matter content, the climate, the management factors, whether you do tillage or not, whether you use cover crops, what rotation, the various nutrient sources, organic, inorganic, placement and timing. So the 3 R's, and then of course that all interacts with these dynamic weather conditions. So precip, temperature, solar radiation, and that really needs to be. It's a very dynamic system where all of these factors have a role and can influence it, and the interactions, the transformations, and the losses. So that's where the modeling approach, like we've started with ADAPT, and is really that's basically designed to deal with that kind of situation. So next would then be, if you have those, you do the modeling and you use the data, and you have the results from that. That gives you an estimate of what's in the soil and what's in the crop. And then you may have some other factors like yield potential, prices, risk factors, and all that. That then allows you to get to the right rate if everything works well. You may want to bring in some external information like sensing, proximal, remote sensing, satellites, whatever. Or you make some actual measurements in the field, like you maybe want to take a tissue test or a soil test. They can all be helpful in terms of making better predictions. But the very simple predictions that are still now being promulgated, and sometimes they're extremely simple. I always use the example of the state of Iowa, which is the largest corn state in the country. They have one single recommendation, one single one for all soils, for all years, for all conditions. And so clearly that's an oversimplification. So in terms of ADAPT, then just a little bit of history. We developed it here at Cornell, and I had the help of a lot of colleagues, Jeff Malconian, John Hudson, even going back to Jeff Wagenet. Then we had that in the public domain for a long time. That was very difficult for the reasons I explained before, the 50 state-based system. Then we decided to commercialize it through a startup company, and developed it into a cloud-based platform and allowed it to be commercialized. And then this company was acquired by Yara International, which is a global crop nutrition company. It's headquartered in Oslo, and it has a digital farming unit that I worked with last year. So I'm also disclosing to you my relationship with that company. So basically, what does AdaptN do? It simulates based on daily time steps, because that's how the climate information comes in, and also based on soil layers. It simulates the water temperature, carbon, and nitrogen dynamics in the soil as it relates to management, weather, etc. It simulates simultaneously the growth of the crop. That's corn currently, and we also have a wheat version. The crop and soil models exchange data, and then from that we estimate how much nitrogen is needed to supplement the current situation. And then it develops all kinds of support information and graphs. Okay, that's in a nutshell, that's what it does. Here you can see some user interfaces. It has sort of a GIS-based component. It has alert options that you can get through mobile devices. It also has ways for consultants to have summary information for all their fields. It provides quite a bit of supportive information on the simulations, as well as some graphical outputs. Okay, so what I really wanted to convey today is that using these kind of approaches, these modeling approaches, also allows you to bring in these sort of sustainability practices, these soil health practices, because a tool like this, the way we developed, it dynamically simulates manure additions or compost additions. It has a cover crop module. It accounts for differences in tillage, no-till versus conventional till or minimal till. It accounts for compaction. It accounts for differences in yield. It accounts for different rotations. And that's really a key component. If we want to go more towards soil health building practices that often involve organic carbon and nitrogen, we then need to adjust our recommendation systems. It also includes some enhanced efficiency products like stabilizers. You can look at the water status and irrigation and things like that. And it also provides, because it does the simulations and it's quantitative, it gives you feedback on how much did you lose through leaching or gaseous losses. It allows you to do scenario evaluations. One of the big advantages of models is that you can manipulate the environment. You can do what if, and so that can be very instructional. In general, we did a lot of on-farm evaluation, and I've presented this before. I don't want to go into it as much, but the tool basically works well. I mean, if after a lot of refinement and tweaking and calibration, we found that these are the AdaptN rates versus the economic optimum N rate, and it really follows the one-to-one line really quite closely. And so we're very proud of that. It basically works. Even it was a little bit below the optimum N rate, but that's actually now been approved again through some tweaking, because that's what you do with a model. You collect data and you improve it. We also found that compared to grower rates, that you can significantly reduce the environmental losses, about 36% of the leaching losses and 39% of the gaseous losses. So just by following a more precise recommendation, you already have significant benefits for the environment. We actually did a lot of calibration of the tool based on lysimeter work that we did in northern New York at the Willsboro farm. And in the past couple of years, we went back and we did a comparison of the AdaptN recommendations versus the conventional corn N calculator, which is a static calculator, and found that we can still reduce the leaching losses significantly by using this approach. Basically, the same estimates that we had before, sort of in that 35 to 40% range. Okay, so there are some clear benefits. So what are sort of the overall advantages of this approach? So from a commercial perspective, and I think what I'm trying to encourage you to do is here to think a little bit commercially, because ultimately, if you want adoption in the marketplace, you have to cater to the commercial needs, right? For one, it's highly scalable technology. Any any computer technology is scalable. It doesn't cost much for the additional 1 acre because the investment is really in developing the computer code and the hosting sites and all that. So relatively low marginal cost. We could go with Adaptan, we could go to 100 million acres, in a matter of a couple of weeks if the demand was there. Currently, we're about a couple of million acres. It provides predictive prescriptions. It allows you to continuously monitor the field, sort of, without having to do field visits. This is a big advantage for a lot of the consultants that spend a lot of time taking soil nitrate samples in late June when it's hot and unpleasant. You can enhance it with field observations if you want to do that. It has these alert options. So if you fall below a certain level, then it gives you an alert. It integrates well with the variable rate management approach, the precision agriculture, you might say. It is a tool. And it integrates, like I said, many sustainable management practices. I just wanted to kind of mention this predictive prescriptions and monitoring. So this picture here on the top was from a site where, so Adaptan, we entered it into an international contest, the 2-lane nitrogen reduction challenge. And we were a finalist, and we were competing with 4 other technologies. And it was a very wet year. And the good thing was this is a field in Louisiana where we had to demonstrate the technology. I was able to monitor that field from my office in my home, 1,300 miles away. And it was a very wet year, and we found that some of the nitrogen had been lost and that the crop would be running out of nitrogen. But you wouldn't see that from the corn here because it looks all perfectly green. It looks fine, right? But the models can be predictive, and that's a good thing. So we predicted that it was going to be running out of nitrogen in about 3 weeks. And so we decided to have a rig come in and provide some additional liquid nitrogen through a high clearance equipment. And then so about a month and a half later, this is a shot of it's a biomass satellite image. That's actually a Yara product. It's called At Farm. And so by the end of June is when the corn was starting to mature because it's the south. It was planted very early, and you can clearly pick out the strips where we had our plots, the Adaptan plots, compared to the other ones. And so one of the reasons why we won that contest was because people were impressed that we were able to predict very well what those nitrogen needs were, even though they were clearly not apparent. Okay. Okay, so I just wanted to mention sort of some lessons learned. Yara did a customer survey last year when I worked for the company. And a lot of the users, consultant farmers and all that, they appreciate the scientific validity. And I think that's really something important to point out. And they like some of the utilities that have been built in. And a lot of that was really, as a result of working with a startup company that was much more customer focused than we were, because we were, more involved with the science. But data is important. If you want to make good predictions, you have to have good input data. Okay. So next steps maybe is using the model with remote sensing. Like I said, the At Farm product, which by the way you can access for free if you're interested in, is maybe a good integration. I think that's sort of the next step. So finally, I want to say something about this co-management of carbon and nitrogen, and why that is also important for soil health. These pictures were from a long-term nitrogen trial in Northeast Iowa from the Iowa State University. And I visited the plots. They weren't my plots, but I knew they were there. And I took some pictures, and you can see here the plots that had received 0 nitrogen for many years, I think maybe 16 years. And you see the one on the right with the high nitrogen rate. And not only do you see the effect on the plants, but you can also clearly see an effect on the soil, because there's been not enough carbon and nitrogen being cycled. So not putting fertilizer on is not necessarily a good strategy for soil health either. Sometimes people think that, well, the fertilizer is the problem. No, it's more complex, and taking out the fertilizer is not the solution. All right, so that's So, and if you want to build organic matter in the soil, you need carbon, but you also need nitrogen, right? Because about 10% or so of the organic matter of the there's about 1/10 of the for each unit of carbon, you need 1/10 of a unit of nitrogen. So the nitrogen has to come from somewhere, right? Now, not just fertilizers, but you want to have these biological processes as well. So more recently, there's been an interest in sort of establishing a performance standard. So we have this problem with all these different nitrogen recommendation systems, including Adapt-N, right? And so which one is the right one? And so working with Environmental Defense Fund, they've been really focusing on this N balance concept. Very easy calculation. You basically look at how much nitrogen goes into a cropping system, into a field, through fertilizer or manure or whatever, and how much do you take off, right? And so it makes it very simple. So if you look here, the inputs and the outputs, right? And if you were at the 0 N, your inputs would be very low. You'd still get some yield, but not much. But you are in this zone here where your nutrient use efficiency is too low. You basically are mining the soil, and we saw that in the picture. If you put too much nitrogen on, like you maybe see with the 240 pounds per acre, yes, you get higher yields, but you have that also with high input, and your efficiency is overall too low. So it's not bad for the soil, but it's bad for the environment. So this is a safe operating space for N fertilizer, where you are putting in enough to have really high productivity, but you're not putting in more than that, right? So we did some research where we did simulations. This was with Shai and also involved Peter Woodbury in our department, where we did an N balance. And so the safe space is sort of between the 0 and 60, because beyond 60, you're starting to see significant environmental losses. And we looked at the timing and the use of nitrification inhibitors in the Midwest over a 7-year period. And what you see here mostly is that if you do fall applications, which is poorly timed for a summer crop, you see that you're outside the optimum range. You're wasting, you're losing too much fertilizer. If you use an inhibitor or stabilizer, you do better. You improve the performance and you're closer to the green line. If you go to all spring applications, with or without inhibitor, you're getting pretty close. And the inhibitor actually doesn't give you a lot of benefit. But if you go to split or in-season application, that's really when you're in the safe zone. So we're trying to link the use of these tools with possible policy initiatives. Okay, so finally, just a couple of minutes, because Andy asked me to address this. So my experience over the past years has been maybe somewhat unusual, certainly in a College of Agriculture, with working with companies and the private sector. And it's been really enjoyable, I have to say. So I worked with startup companies like Agronomic Technology Corporation, which is the company that licensed Adapt-N. We're also doing some work with a company that's called Robot. It's a robotic company. If I have some time, I'll show you a slide, and others to a lesser extent. I found these experiences to be very interesting. They're small companies. They're very dynamic. They don't have bureaucracies. They make decisions, when they need to. I found a lot of these people to be very talented. Entrepreneurs are a different breed, and I have a lot of respect for them. The companies are very focused. They're focused on one or two things, but they have very limited resources. They're often, doing things on a shoestring because they have to work off venture capital. And so it's, but great experience. So then, because ATC was acquired by Yara, I had a lot of experience working with them. I did my sabbatical, for at least part of the year last year. It didn't work out so well because of the pandemic. Got some experience with working with Danone as well. It's a French dairy company, and Walmart about 5-6 years ago as part of their sustainability initiative. I found that very different. They have a lot of resources. They sometimes are highly profitable companies, and they're willing to invest. But you also have a lot of players, typically that you're working with. You're working with MBAs or people that maybe have experience in digital technologies, but in a very different area, nothing related to agriculture. But they also do have powerful connections. For Yara is because it's a big global company. They partner with IBM and the weather company on weather data, and that's a type of access that you wouldn't have. But you're also working within a company that has many other objectives. Like ATC was focused on just adapt and made it very simple. Okay. And it's also, you often sort of struggle a little bit with, working with people with MBA degrees who don't really understand, the complexity of what we're dealing with. They sometimes want a simple solution, and then you have to say, no, it's really a lot more complex than that. And then I also had some good interactions with NGOs like EDF and the Nature Conservancy. And I won't take time, but they're good people. They often have similar constraints to what we're dealing with at universities. But I think they also have a very important role. They also have often very good connections, either with the private sector or university. So they have a good bridging function. Just quickly wanted to show Robot because that's, we have some active collaboration. It's a company that was founded by a Cornell graduate, and it makes small field robots. It has a lot of sensors on it. And so Zafer Bestas, who is a PhD student with me, most of you know him, we're working on this lower canopy sensing to look at nitrogen deficiencies. Also, it has we worked with them on developing a cover crop seeding option. So because it has rubber tracks, it drops cover crops seeds right in front of the tracks, then it runs over them to kind of incorporate and give good seed soil contact. And you really get pretty good results in terms of cover crop establishment. So that's it's kind of an exciting opportunity. Okay, so finally, summing it up, we really need to think in terms of better integration of carbon, nitrogen, and soil health. And it really is a win-win-win opportunity. We can get more carbon into the soil, we can improve the health of the soil, we can make nitrogen use more efficient, and we can improve yields. So the improving organic matter requires nitrogen, but eventually reduces nitrogen needs, especially if you can account for them with good recommendation systems. So, and as I mentioned, there's a lot of things that we can now incorporate into these models that allow us to be more nuanced about nitrogen recommendations. And finally, I wanted to mention just 2 days ago, Joseph sent me this. It's in Albany. They're talking about the drafting some legislation related to soil health and soil resiliency. So that's kind of interesting. It took a long time for New York to sort of get excited about soil health, even though we were doing a lot of work. But now they really want to go all out, and so it will be very exciting if we can see some of this legislation coming about. So let's keep our fingers crossed. It's still in draft form, but if this happens, then that would be great. All right, thank you very much. I want to acknowledge the individuals that are listed here that sort of contributed in many ways, and also the funding. So with that, Andy, I'm going to throw it back to you and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Harold. You covered a tremendous amount of ground. So we're a little bit over, but Harold, do you have time for a couple questions if there's some from the floor?
I certainly do. Yes, if people want to stick around.
Great. So open floor. If you'd like to pose a question, please just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask Harold. Zoom etiquette, Harold. I think it's complicated. I'll ask you one.
Okay.
Short one. I was curious on within the Adapt-N framework, if you are doing an in-season yield forecast now as part of the recommendations logic, and how you're handling that if you are.
Yeah, we're actually not doing an in-season yield forecast. And it's something that we'll probably will be working on. we felt that, and based on interactions with consultants and farmers, that they typically have a much better idea of that themselves, because they know their yield records. Of course, they know the yield records. That's their bottom line, right? And so and they have some sense of whether there needs to be some adjustment based on weather. So we leave the yield estimate, the yield goal, actually to the user, and we're not estimating it. We could. The model does allow for it, and it does a pretty good job. But I think it actually doesn't do as good of a job as the farmer or the consultant themselves, based on the historical records that they have.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks for that, Harold. Other questions from the floor?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Kira.
Hi, Harold. So
Hi.
has AdaptN been used in other countries yet? And if not, do you have any plans for that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. In fact, that's what I spent a significant part of last year on, was enabling the tool for other geographies. So that included Brazil, Argentina, Europe, and South Africa. So we basically got the databases, the soil databases and climate databases, all for those geographies. It's interesting when you work within a company. Yara actually is not that well known within the U.S. They focus more on specialty crops, and they, like, for example, they don't sell a lot of fertilizer in places like Iowa, in the Corn Belt. But in Brazil, they control about 60% of the market. So they're a dominant player in Brazil, to a lesser extent Argentina, and of course in Europe they're very big because they are a Norway-based company. So we basically got it ready for those new geographies, but there's a lot involved. You can't just kind of say, oh, here's the tool, it's available. You need to have a billing infrastructure. You need to have partners to work with, and all of that. So, and probably in Brazil, it will probably be rolled out through their own consultant network. While in the US, we work with partners. Yara doesn't do any consulting or fertilizer sales, and where AdaptN is being used. So in the US and Canada, we're working through other companies like MFA, Missouri Fertilizer Association. They're, I think, maybe about the 5th largest fertilizer dealer in the US, and they use AdaptN. And there's a lot of consultants. Even some of the competitors, like Nutrien is a competitor to Yara. They actually, use AdaptN. So every geography is different in terms of how it can be used. But we did the technical work, the scientific work, to enable it, and so it is functional and we've tested it in those other areas. But that doesn't mean that's been rolled out yet and commercialized. It just takes a lot more than that. And it also kind of it sort of brings, like I was saying, the company has a lot of priorities, and AdaptN is just one of those. So it's sometimes you just have to wait till other things have been resolved.
Yeah. What scale do you see it being used at? Like, is it mostly for larger farms, or could it? What does it cost for farmers? Could it eventually be scaled down to smaller scale farms, or?
Yeah. So this is something that the startup company really tried to address. So initially, when it was ours, when it was still within Cornell before the licensing, it was basically open to anybody. When the startup company commercialized it, they did the same, but in terms of it's available to anyone. But in terms of their marketing, they focused more on aggregators. So other fertilizer companies or consultants, primarily because the cost of dealing with many small farms it was exorbitant, too much for a startup company. Now Yara maybe will have a different philosophy, but obviously So, and in terms of the pricing, when you go to a large client, and say a client signs up for, let's say, 500,000 acres, you can provide a much better pricing for that than you do for somebody who has 100 acres. So obviously, because with computational technologies, the economies of scale are incredible, right? I mean, unless sort of hardware type companies where it costs a lot to produce the hardware, with computational technologies, the more acres, the more you can spread the cost, right? So that's why companies have an incentive to say, if you want to sign up for 500,000 acres, we can give you a really good deal. That's kind of how that works.
I see.
So, and I agree. I mean, there's a downside to that in terms of, smaller farmers, and that, maybe needs to be addressed at some point in time. The startup companies are in survival mode. I mean, it's just, I mean, day to day, I remember, one day you think like, oh, this is all going great and all that. And then the next week you have something and you're like, oh, we're going to be out of business, by next month. So it's a real roller coaster, and working with a larger company like Yara, at least you have that stability.
Yeah.
And I should add, I was not really involved in the business end for the startup company. We just did the science. But of course, I talked to them about it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the question, Kira. We should probably close in a minute. Is there any other burning question for Harold before we give him our thanks?
I have a very actually easy question, because it goes back to the very beginning of your seminar, Harold. But it still puzzles me, because you're showing the organic matter content in the Midwest versus in New York and the Northeast. And your point was that in the grain crop production, they're removing all that grain carbon. On the other hand, we know that in something like corn, 50% of the biomass above ground is in the stover, the leaves and stem. And so that would be returned back to the land, right? Whereas here in New York, we're harvesting 50% of our corn as silage, and we remove a large fraction of the above ground biomass. And then I'm also thinking about those forages, alfalfa, grass, and we cut them 3 times a year and remove all of the forage. So can you help me understand what's going on there?
Yeah, Tim, it's a lot of this is the cycling. So you're right. Depending on whether you look at the carbon or the nutrients, like you say, when you harvest corn, it's a little bit, it's more like 55% or something like that of the biomass, right, gets harvested. And but the nutrients, of course, in the grain, are higher than in the stover, right, other than potassium. And so you're removing those, and they're just gone, right? I mean, like in a cash grain operation, they're just, but in a livestock based, let's say a dairy system, you're right, you're harvesting all the entire plant, other than the roots, but you are returning most of that through manure. It comes back, at least a significant part of it, and that, from what we can see in the data, that does seem to matter. Now, when you go to a perennial system, right? I mean, the other advantage, of course, that a dairy system has, a typical dairy farm in New York will have corn silage, and then they'll grow a perennial, alfalfa or some alfalfa grass mixture or whatever. And so they have, at least part of the rotation is a perennial crop, so that has benefits. And yes, you harvest most of that, but apparently having some of that returned through manure sort of gives you that net benefit. Okay. I mean, I would love to talk some more with you about that, Tim, because you are much more of an expert in that part. We're just we have the data now to do the analytics and to say, hey, these, we are seeing these kind of patterns.
Yeah.
So next, I think
striking.
it's next. Yeah, it really is, and So next week, Joseph, I think it's next week, Joseph is going to be doing the seminar. And so he'll go a little bit more into depth on that. But I think it's not really very well recognized that these carbon and nitrogen flows are so significant, and that it matters. And it was really that early study that Aubrey found it that we were just puzzled, like, why are the Midwestern soils? I mean, 1% organic matter difference, that's a lot. That's really huge, So yeah, it's interesting. But let's talk about that sometime, and I'd like to get more of your insights into that. Yeah,
that'd be great. Thanks very much. Very good.
You're
Excellent
welcome.
Seminar.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks, Harold. Really, really great talk, and deeply appreciated. And on behalf of everyone, thanks a lot for giving it, and thanks everyone for attending. But we'll end here. Thanks again, Harold.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.